The rain stood still frozen in midair, the only sound being that of a distant clock. The tower's rapid wail of its alarm shattered into pieces. The golden light tried to flicker back on, yet it failed every time, as if its attempt had been cut off before it could begin. The figure's smirk slowly faded, his adrenaline quickly depleting, his bravado falling apart as he sighed while he lowered his arm, his face falling to a dead cold stare. He wasn't sure how to feel. In all honesty, he had been dreaming of this moment since the very start, yet now he felt dull, though he kept his guard raised, unsure of his old friend's next move. Inside the tower, everything was falling apart. The mounds of eyes and flesh shifted and stretched apart, its panic overloading. How was he here? How was he alive? The tower turned its attention back to its old friend, finding him simply staring up at him, waiting, giving him time. It could use that. But what could it do? Per phase. No, that was too much. But did it have a choice? If he managed to kill it, the cycle would end. The tower steeled its resolve, every last lump of flesh and eyeballs compacting as it moved to put its sudden plan into action. A tall zombie-like figure sat in a wobbling chair within a room that glowed with a soft purple light. The figure being the only thing in sight aside from his old flimsy chair that somehow held his titan-like frame. It was the Thin Man. Tendrils of flesh shot out from the darkness, wrapping the Thin Man in a cocoon. Yet he didn't resist. In truth, it had been years since he had been awake. After all, sleep was so much better than reality. At least in sleep you could just be. The cocoon of flesh clumped together, combining into a single blob on the back of the Thin Man's neck. He slinked up to his feet, his head dangling to his side, utterly limp, while he moved like a puppet controlled by a novice. He stood up, his upper body limp, neck and arms dangling in random directions, his legs being the only thing with some form of proper movement. As the door swung open, the Thin Man's form glitched before he vanished in a volatile burst of static. The one-armed figure tilted his head, slightly confused. He had expected his old friend to do something, but now. He sighed softly, stepping forward, a mix of vengeance and regret fueling his movements. He both wanted to and hated the idea of killing the tower, but he needed the cycle to end, to finally save everyone. Then static began to crackle throughout the air. A static hum filled the air, shaking the very world itself. The one-armed figure froze, his eyes widening, the clock hands within crawling to a stop. His face showed his only current emotion, fear? No. It was pure hate. Any and all slivers of sympathy washed away, the light in his eyes dimming, his stare turning blank, 3 simple words leaking from his gaping mouth, holding the silent threat. You wouldn't dare. Purple light stretched out from the opening tower, the cold stone scraping to the side as a shadow formed the light, clearing a path of rain from where he walked and hobbled. The one-armed figure's face softened the pain, and it was clear to see his eyes had closed for a few seconds as he held back the small trickle of tears that tried to break out. He took a deep breath, letting the air through his mouth and out through his nose, his head turning downcast as he did. The eye on the center of the tower closed, trying to block out the sight as much as it could, with only one thought running through its mind. I'm sorry. The Thin Man was not looking down at the one-armed figure just a few small steps away. The puppeteered Thin Man wasted no time reaching out a hand, the world bending and twist under the pressure of his static energy, only for the force to be evenly matched by the one-armed figure's, whose own energy reached out, shaking the air like it was caught in a vice grip. Forces clashed the middle ground, ripping anything and everything apart as the one-armed figure and the Thin Man pushed more energy to their clash. Until, boom! The Thin Man was launched backwards and into the air, his limp body flailing in the wind before he pulled himself up in mid-air, vanishing in a burst of static before appearing on top of a random building to his right. The one-armed figure followed, moving to the top of the next building in a flash of green glitches. A leg raised just above the one-armed figure courtesy of the Thin Man, the rest of his body hanging limp before he crashed his foot to where the one-armed figure once stood, only to find the remnants of glitches as the figure was nowhere to be found. The Thin Man soon found the figure once more as he leaped into the air with a bang before he slammed his fist towards the Thin Man's gut, a shockwave sending him crashing across multiple buildings. Bits of rubble floated in the air just above the one-armed figure, frozen in place. In the blink of an eye, the pieces of rubble shot out in a green blur, heading straight towards the recovering Thin Man, who had just enough time to form a barrier of static energy in front of himself. Rubble hit the shield like cannon fire, pushing the Thin Man back with each rapid hit until eventually the shield shattered to pieces once the final bit of rubble hit it dead center. the thin man stammering back his arm already flailing for another blast of static. His desperate attack was countered by the one-armed figure who had appeared below the thin man, jumping up and ramming a fist into the thin man's chin, sending him flying into the air. But he wasn't done. The form of the thin man glitched in midair, being covered in the same green energy. The tower tried to move his spontaneous puppet, yet it was no use. Now the Tower of Panic, its plan falling apart. No, 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 how can he still be fighting? He can barely stand. The one-armed figure cocked his arm back, his fist glowing slightly before the thin man came crashing down towards him in the blink of an eye. The one-armed figure crashing his fist into his gut again, sending him even higher into the air. Then it happened again. And again. The next 5 strikes were the same, with the midair thin man being pulled back down only to be hit even harder, flying harder into the air, the pattern repeating again and again, each hit more powerful than the last, shockwaves shaking the pale city as a whole. Time stood still as the one-armed figure reeled back his arm once more, the form on the thin barely holding itself together, now mostly a mass of static. The one-armed figure's face showed pain, horror, fear, but most of all, regret. His voice quivered, shook to the point of sounding like a child ready to burst into tears.
I'm sorry, Mono.
His fist plunged into the gut of the thin man, being the final nail in the coffin. The thin's man from bulged and shivered before he exploded in a burst of static, now fully destroying the area of the pale city that once clung to life, the buildings and streets crumbling under the pressure. The tower was hit the hardest. Stones slip apart and cracked into smaller and smaller pieces, the mush of flesh and eyes that formed the tower scream in both horror and desperation. No, no! Within seconds the tower collapsed in on itself, crumbling to chunks on rubble and clumps of dust as it crashed to the ground, kicking up a dust cloud that reached across the pale city's lower sections. The one-armed figure looked to the ruined tower and sighed, turning his head to the left, to the ocean. That should have been quick enough. The single clock hand in each of his eyes spun rapidly for a few seconds before he slightly smiled with relief. Ah, good. Just made it to the cabin. Plenty of time. The one-armed figure turned his head back to the leftovers of the tower before he blurred towards it in a flash of green glitches. Through a crack in some pieces of the tower, a small mash of flesh and eyeballs slinked out, rolling over itself to make it further out as far as it could. Once fully out in the pouring rain, the flesh and eyes began to shift and clump together, slowly changing shape and color. After only a few seconds, the mass of flesh and eyes had fully morphed into a human appearance. He looked to be an older teenager with long black hair and saddlebags under his eyes. His clothing was simple, a black baggy hoodie and pants with brown shoes that looked to be falling apart. He crawled out further into the mud and gravel that ripped at the tender flesh of his hands, his form quivering. He pushed out a hand ready to stand, until the one-armed figure appeared over him, showing a smile that was filled with rage and hate. Hey, Mush! Mush looked up in panic, his eyes widening, his voice growing weaker. See, Chime. Chime chuckled, though his smile faltered slightly, his hate clear leaking through. Been a while. Hasn't it, old friend? Mush tried to speak, to defend himself, to plead that the cycle was the only way. But he stopped, letting himself fall to only be supported by his elbow. Just do it. Mush slumped his head, ready to accept his death, a mix of shame and disbelief as his past and worry for the future clashed in his mind. No. Mush's head shot up in shock as he looked into the neutral face of Chime, the glow in his eyes dimming slightly. Mush was now utterly confused. Why wasn't Chime going to kill him? After everything. Mush's voice filled with hope, though it was quickly shot dead by Chime, who pointed his only arm to Mush, his smile returning slightly. Don't get me wrong, I really want to kill you like majorly, but you're more useful alive. Huh? Mush's confusion only grew. Chime sighed. Need you in order to get my arm back and finally kill it. Mush clenched his fist, his angry raising was Chime, still unable to accept the truth. He turned his gaze to Chime, only shifting slightly under his old friend heavy gaze. You can be serious? How many times did I tell you it can't be killed? None of us can fight it. The cycle was the only way to keep it out. Chime shook his head. No. Mush blinked, then his eye twitched. What do you mean no? Chime shrugged. It opened a hole the second you started it. Mush's eyes widened, his fear was the first thing to rush over his face. But then came the confusion. Tita, then why did it come? Don't try to lie to me, I know how that thing would act, it wouldn't hesitate. Mush's yells died in his throat as he was picked up into the air by Chime, who was holding him by the neck. His grip tightened just enough to make Mush gag but still let him speak. The clock hand within his eyes slowly to a stop, his voice cold while holding to many years of pain. It didnt underscore basa USEIW. SH old underscore OFF underscore IR underscore TIM. Mush's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates, the pain from Chime's grip forgotten instantly. Why you could fight it but you're. Mush looked down to Chime's missing right arm while Chime himself chuckled. Disarmed. Chime sighed, the air leaking from his mouth glitching slightly. But yes, I could fight it. To a standstill, in fact. Guess I was right after all then, huh? Real icin hit Mush like a truck as Chime let him fall back into the mud, tears leaking from his eyes. I didn't have to. Chime sighed once more as he leaned down to the sobbing Mush. Yeah, you did basically every wrong. Especially with that you just pulled. Mush whipped his tear, now standing up fully, being only a little taller than Chime himself, yet he felt like an ant in comparison. Mush took a deep breath and turned his eyes to Chime, his gaze resolute. I know you hate me. I hate me too. But I can help. Please, Chime. Let me help. Chime tilted his head to the left. I already said you're more useful alive and that I need you to get my arm back. Mush blinked before rubbing the back of his head while trying to wipe his eyes. Estet sorry. Chime huffed, stepping backwards up to a small pieces of rubble before snapping his fingers to get Mush's attention. Well, we're not done yet after all. Am not doing this alone. Mush stepped back in shock, his mind reeling from Chime's words, repeating them over and over again to try and make sure he heard it right. Why you don't actually mean? Chime laughed, raising his hand high while snapping his fingers once more. A pulse of green glitching energy coursed out, but it didn't merely stop at the edges of the pale city. No. It carried across the entirety of nowhere, all while Chime laughed. What can I say? We're getting the gang back together. The north wind floated above a barren wasteland, hiding its true form in the middle of an impassable sandstorm, a mental smirk on his face as he drifted about, not a care in the world. The ferryman leaned over the edge of his boat, looking out to the horizon of the ocean, sighing softly before he took a swig of his flask, taking long gulps of the golden liquid. The mirror man sat at a table, a cup of tea in hand, taking slow slips, his mind lost in his own delusions, all while an endless hall of mirrors showed what could have been of his life. Trapped under a collection of boulders on the ocean floor lay the pretender, contempt to simple be until the cycle started over again. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The pretender eyes shot open, her arms bolting upwards, effortlessly pushing the boulders off herself as he sat up in both astonishment and renewed hope. The endless hall of mirrors shattering into pieces, the glass shards shoot out in all directions as the cup of tea the mirror man was drink fell to the floor and broke into pieces. The flash the ferryman had been holding sunk into the ocean's depths as the ferryman himself froze in place. The nationwide sandstorm dissipated in a slip second, the humanoid form of the north wind being shown for all to see, being made up of purple and black wind. All four looked towards the direction of the sound, their minds all speaking in perfect sync. He's alive.